it's less obvious to me that there are reasons for the BBC to pay out. And, is it a good use of licence fee payers' money to pay out to enrich further Donald Trump? I think there's some questions about that.
The clock ticks for the BBC. Donald Trump has given the corporation till Friday to respond to his demand for a full and fair retraction of the documentary about him or face being sued for £1 billion. But how is the BBC going to decide how to respond when the Director General and the head of news have both resigned? More reports are emerging from inside the corporation. The chair is being blamed for slowing down an apology to the president, and the leaders of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, wants one of the board, Robbie Gibb, to be sacked after he was accused of political interference. Matt Walsh, the head of the School of Journalism at Cardiff University and a former executive producer at ITN, joins us now to go through all of that. Good morning, Matt.
Morning.
Let's start with this lawsuit. How worried should the BBC be about this, do you think?
Well, Donald Trump does have a track record of suing news organisations when he feels that he has not had appropriately positive coverage from them. A number of news organisations in the US have paid out rather than face his wrath. Usually, though, there is a reason for doing that from a business point of view. There might be a merger or going through that has regulatory approval that needs to be sought from the FCC. So there are reasons for them to do so. I think it's less obvious to me that there are reasons for the BBC to pay out. And is it a good use of licence fee payers' money to pay out to enrich further Donald Trump? I think there's some questions about that. I also think there's some pretty strong questions about whether or not the court in Florida, where he says he's going to launch the action, actually has any jurisdiction over the BBC on this particular issue. So I think that there are some pretty big hurdles that Donald Trump has to get over. But there's no kind of question that he is going to go ahead with some kind of action, and the BBC needs to respond to it.
And that's the point, really, isn't it? Because you may well be right. The jurisdiction, there are questions about whether or not the case is timed out, even in some courts. That stuff doesn't really matter to Donald Trump, does it? What matters is that he's opened up a row with the huge broadcasting company, one of the most trusted, arguably by some in the world. He's opened a rift with them, which lots of other people sort of agree with.
Yeah, absolutely. For Donald Trump, as you were suggesting earlier, it's a win-win situation. He enjoys the confrontation that he's having with the BBC. He feels that he's exerting the power of the White House in bringing the BBC to heel and to stop its critiques. And the BBC has ambitions in the United States. There's no question about that. The BBC wants to encourage more people to consume its journalism in the United States. It already has quite a good reputation in the US with US audiences, but they are relatively small by comparison with the networks in the US at the moment. It wants to expand that. This will certainly make that more complicated and more difficult for them in the short term.
Let's talk about some of the process regarding what's happened here, because there are some questions about why an apology was not offered or why an admission that something had gone wrong, particularly with Panorama, although there are other issues that have led up to where the BBC is today. But with the Panorama programme and Donald Trump, there's a suggestion that BBC News, that arm of the corporation, wanted to apologise, but the board prevented that from happening. How damaging is that suggestion?
I think it's really damaging. I think that one of the sort of main kind of effects of this row, which has seen two of the most senior people within the BBC resign, is that it has exposed the failings of the current governance of the BBC and shown that they just don't work. The BBC had a new governance structure brought in a few years ago, which essentially created a combined board with executive members, so the Director General and the head of news, but also non-executive members working together to push the BBC's governance forward. It's pretty clear to me that process has not worked. And part of the reason that process has not worked is that some of the people that were appointed to the board as political appointees have different interests to perhaps those on the executive. There needs to be more distance in place between those that are responsible for holding the executive to account from the operational activities of the BBC and its journalism on a day-to-day basis. It's pretty clear that at the moment that distance is not in place, and it means that the BBC it risks having political interference being created in its journalism, which will be absolutely inimical to trust in its journalism going forward. So there's got to be, as part of the charter renewal, which was the process that we're about to go into in a few months' time, where every 10 years the BBC's charter is reviewed and its governance is reviewed. I think it is absolutely vital that the DCMS, which is the department leading that, looks very hard at the governance structures of the BBC and asks whether or not they are fit for purpose.
Do you think then there's any credibility in this argument that there is some kind of plot to take the BBC down from the inside? You know, that there are sort of right-wing figures inside the BBC's senior teams who have been sort of trying to work with others outside the corporation to bring the BBC to its knees. Do you give that any credibility?
I think that the coup argument is one that has been put forward on a number of occasions by people, but I think people need to produce evidence that that is the case. I think there's a lot of rumour and speculation that's associated with that. It's not at all clear to me that it is obvious that those are the case, that is the case. But I do think that the idea that political appointees should be involved on a daily basis with the operational aspects of the BBC's journalism is clearly wrong. I think that is something that it doesn't matter whether or not you believe that there is a shadowy plot to bring down the BBC from the inside. That aspect of the BBC's governance is clearly not working.
Can we ask you finally, Matt, we've been having a conversation here in the office. We are journalists. We like to indulge in a bit of, I suppose, theory about our craft and our profession. Do you think, you teach young journalists, you teach the art of journalism or the trade of journalism, is there a problem with young people coming into the profession, or has something happened recently with young people coming into the profession and confusing, in a way, activism and journalism and their personal beliefs and the way that you're supposed to do this job?
So, is there a problem with young people? Never. There is never a problem. Do young people have strong idealistic beliefs about the way in which the world works and how they want to impact and affect the world? Yeah, absolutely. Of course they do. That's an absolutely reasonable aspect of being a young person. And there are loads of ways in which you, as a journalist, can do that, and that you can be campaigning and you can be somebody who wants to change the world for the better through your journalism. That's reasonable aspects of journalism. Where it is less reasonable is in aspects of regulated broadcasting, where you have to put your personal opinions and your personal beliefs to one side when you're reporting on the news. You know, people should not be able to know and understand the ways in which you view the world, the ways in which you vote as a broadcaster. That's just one of the rules that we currently operate with it. Now, those rules may change. These rules are being pushed all the time by different broadcasting organisations, and the regulator Ofcom is constantly reviewing the broadcasting code to see whether or not there are ways in which we might do things better. But at the moment, it's still the case that everybody who works within broadcasting has to be impartial, or duly impartial, with their coverage, and be fair to everybody, and not present a activist view of the world through their journalism. But in other fields of journalism and other aspects of journalism, it's perfectly reasonable.
Matt, thank you so much. Great to have you with us on the programme this morning.
Thank you very much.
That is Matt Walsh, the head of the School of Journalism at Cardiff University and also a former executive producer at ITN.
The argument from the Prescott memo, which if you can read it online, you can read all 8,000 words of it, isn't that necessarily just individual journalists had pushed their agenda. It's the BBC was so frightened of being seen to be, for example, racist or on the wrong side of history when it comes to transgender, that it infiltrated their news-making judgment. So the argument is there's a story that Prescott cites where they said there was racism in the insurance industry and black people got a worse deal than white people when it comes to that. And the evidence for that wasn't clear, and the evidence for that wasn't then substantiated. But the BBC really ran with it because they wanted to show themselves as an anti-racist organisation. When it comes to transgender stories, they wanted to show themselves as an organisation that is friendly to the worldview that suggested a certain view on gender. And so that, to me, is harder to say, well, it's just a young journalist coming in banging their head on a certain subject. It felt to me that institutionally, this is what the Prescott report was saying, institutionally, when it comes to certain issues of culture and issues of ideology, the BBC thought there was a right side and a wrong side, and it wanted to be on the right side on race, the right side on gender, the right side on Israel, the right side on climate change. And that really creates the notion that there is always a straightforward right and wrong side, which is, of course, not how the real messy, complicated world works.
Yeah, there's a really interesting article today in the Times. It's about the story of Kath Lang. She's the former chief writer for BBC News, and she says she was forced out in 2023 because of her gender-critical views. She worked at the BBC for 25 years. And she talks about how there were very senior editors who deferred to younger journalists. She describes witnessing a senior editor at the News at 10, so one of the flagship news programmes, deferring to a younger LGBT broadcast journalist to ask what kind of language should be used. And she says that people were treated as experts because they were believers in the idea of gender identity.
Exactly.
And that's where the lines become blurred, and that's where your views on your sort of activism or your personal views on something are starting to inform the way a news programme is developed. And there should be a very clear line between those things. You should consider all opinions, but you should not be deferring.
And some of it can be done for a laudable reason. You know, you might consult people in your office. I'm sure this happened at the BBC, who are black, for example, about we're doing this story. Is this an acceptable way of discussing an issue that relates to ethnicity? Is this an acceptable way of discussing an issue that relates to gender? But the point is you're then handing power to people because of their identity. And if you do that with only one set of people and not all sets of people, because it's impossible to do it to all sets of people, you end up with a pointed set of news values. Yeah. And that's precisely what Prescott was saying. It's interesting stuff. We'll get into this over the course. There's going to be a big meeting at the BBC where they're going to confront some of this today. The other thing we're going to do that's really interesting at 8 o'clock, we're effectively going to litigate the Donald Trump complaint, because we've got his old attorney here saying why he thinks Trump will succeed. And we're going to get our great legal expert, Pia Sama, to say how she would really defend it. She represents our company. She represents the Times. She's a really experienced media lawyer. How she would advise the BBC to defend or settle, pay up, pay off. I used to do this for a living, and it's very difficult because at some point you might say, we know we're a bit in the wrong, so we need to get out of this as cheaply as possible. How do you get out of it as cheaply as possible with Donald Trump? Because it's licence fee payers' money. So if you fight it and lose, it's much worse than settling it quickly.